In the winter of 1891, in a small lumber town carved out of the forest north of Lake Superior, a man signed his daughter away to settle a gambling debt. He traded his only child, Rosalind Hale, 23 years old, for the forgiveness of what he owed to a hard-eyed creditor named Pruitt, and walked away from the transaction believing he had been clever. What Pruitt intended to do with a young woman and a modest sum of cash was not a mystery anyone in Harwick, Terrio cared to examine too closely. But what neither man counted on was the logging foreman who witnessed the agreement being drawn up at the back table of the Harwick Inn, and who had spent 40 years of his life refusing to walk past a wrong without naming it. His name was Everard Colquhoun. He was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, and had buried a wife and a son in the same hard winter 7 years prior. He had not, in the time since, found any particular reason to insert himself into the affairs of others, until that Tuesday in December when Rosalind Hale's father pressed a shaking pen to a piece of paper, and Pruitt smiled the way men smile when they have already decided what a thing is worth. Everard did not make a scene. He was not that kind of man. He finished his coffee, left a coin on the bar, and went directly to find out who the girl was and where she lived. She was in the small house at the edge of the mill road, the one with the blue door that had faded to gray. When he knocked, she answered in an apron, flour on her wrists, and looked at him with the flat, careful expression of a woman who had learned not to expect anything good from a knock at the door. He told her plainly what he had seen. He did not soften it. She stood very still for a long moment. Then she said, "He told me the debt was paid." Everard said nothing. He didn't need to. She looked past him out at the road, at the mill's smoke rising gray against the pale December sky. Then she looked back at him. "What does Pruitt mean to do with me?" He met her eyes. "Nothing good." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. There was no crying, no pleading. Just a woman doing the arithmetic of a very bad situation and arriving at a number she didn't like but could work with. He told her he had a timber claim up the Namawini River, 2 hours north by sled, a cookhouse, a bunkhouse, and a foreman's cabin that had sat empty since the last season ended. He said he needed someone to manage the domestic side of the camp before the cutters came back in January. He said there was a lock on the door of the foreman's cabin, and a key that answered only to her. She studied him for a long moment. Her name was Rosalind, she said. Not girl, not miss, not whatever Pruitt had written on that paper. Everard said, "I know, Rosalind." She packed a single trunk. The road north was a cut-through silence of spruce and birch, the sled tracks icing over almost as fast as the horse made them. She sat beside him, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled of cedar and old smoke, watching the trees thicken and the town fall away behind them. She did not ask where they were going. She had seen the direction from the start. "What's the camp called?" she asked after an hour. "Dunmore's Reach," he said. "After the man who first cut it. He's dead now." She accepted this without comment. They rode the rest of the way, in the particular silence of two people who understand that small talk would be an insult to the size of what had just happened. The camp was rough cut and practical. A cluster of log buildings set back from the river's bend, smoke still drifting from the cookhouse chimney, where the caretaker had banked the fire. The foreman's cabin was separate from the rest, small but solid, with a good iron stove and a window that faced east toward the tree line. Everard set her trunk inside the door and handed her the key. "You'll want supper," he said. She looked around the cabin. "I'll want to know what's expected of me first." "Fair enough," he told her. The cutters returned on the 4th of January, 14 men. 3 meals a day, 6 days a week. Sunday was her own. Provisions were ordered from the Harwick General Store. He kept the accounts. She didn't need to beg for anything she needed. She told him, and it was got. She listened carefully. When he finished, she asked 2 precise questions about the cookstove's temperament and one about whether the well froze in January. Then she said, "That's manageable." He nodded and left her to it. He didn't know what to make of her those first few days. She moved through the cookhouse like she was mapping it, quietly, methodically, learning every drawer and shelf before she committed to any of it. She did not chatter. She did not ask for reassurance. When she found the pantry in a state of poor organization, she reorganized it without comment and left a handwritten list on the table of what needed ordering before the men arrived. On the second evening, he found her sitting near the cookhouse stove after supper, reading by the lamp. She had a book open on her knee, something dense and worn at the spine. He paused in the doorway. She looked up. "You're welcome to sit," she said. "This is your camp." He sat. He didn't read. He looked at the fire. After a while, she said, without looking up from the page, "My father has been in debt to Pruitt for 3 years. I knew about the first 2. I didn't know about the third until tonight." He said nothing. She turned a page. "I'm not telling you that so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because you ought to know who you've brought into your camp and what the full shape of it is," he said. "It doesn't change anything." She looked up at that. Her eyes were gray, he noticed, and steadier than most men's he'd worked with. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." She went back to her book. He went back to studying the fire, and felt for the first time in a long while that he was in the presence of someone worth being quiet with. January came hard and fast. The cutters arrived on the 4th, 14 men, loud with cold and hunger, stomping snow off their boots in the entrance to the cookhouse, filling the small space with the smell of pine pitch and wet wool. Rosalind had biscuits on the table before the last man was through the door. The camp foreman who oversaw the cutting crews was a man called Dougal Fenn. Large, red-faced, 20 years of timber work behind him, and possessed of the particular confidence of a man who assumed every woman in a cookhouse was either his mother or his problem. He looked Rosalind over on that first morning with an expression she recognized from long experience as the beginning of a presumption. He said, "So you're Everard's girl." She handed him a plate. "I'm the cook. You're welcome to your breakfast." He laughed. A few of the younger men laughed too, uncertain whether to. Over the following weeks, she managed the cookhouse with a precision that silenced most of the early questions. She learned the men's names and what they preferred and didn't comment on either. When young Soren Hawk burned his hand on a jammed log chain and nobody seemed sure what to do, she was the one who packed the wound and changed the dressing daily until it closed clean. When the provisions order came in short on lard, she recalculated 3 days of meals without mentioning the shortage to anyone except Everard, who corrected it by the next supply run. Dougal noticed. He didn't say anything for a while. That was its own kind of adjustment. Everard noticed too, though he was more deliberate about not showing it. He had a habit of coming to the cookhouse after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, in that quiet hour between supper and dark when the lamp burned low and the stove settled. Sometimes he brought the account ledgers. Sometimes he just came. Neither of them examined that too carefully. One evening in late January, she was mending a tear in one of young Soren's work shirts. The boy had no mother nearby and had asked her shyly, and she'd said yes without making anything of it. And Everard was at the table with the ledgers, and she said, without looking up from the needle, "You used to have a son. He went still," she said. "There's a pair of small boots in the back of the supply shed, outgrown. Too small to be yours and too well kept to have been forgotten." She paused. "I'm not asking for details. I just wanted you to know I'd seen them. That I know something about you the same way you know something about me." He was quiet for a long time. "Then his name was Thomas. He was 6. My wife was Harriet." She looked up. "I'm sorry." He nodded. The word was good enough because she meant it. They didn't speak again for a while. But the silence after that was a different kind of silence than the one before. February brought the worst cold of the season and a dispute that nearly fractured the camp. A man named Aldous Cray. He came on as a spare axeman mid-month when another broke his collarbone. Arrived with a mouth full of opinions he hadn't earned, and a habit of saying things about women in camp that he believed were too quiet to carry. He was wrong about that. Sound carries in timber camps the way it carries across still water. And Rosalind heard most of what he said and said nothing, because she had survived worse and had no intention of giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. What she hadn't counted on was Dougal. On a Thursday evening, Aldous Cray said something at the far end of the cookhouse table that made 3 men go quiet and 2 laugh, and Dougal Fenn set down his fork with a deliberate click and said, in the voice he used to stop a runaway team, "That's enough." Aldous looked at him. "What?" Dougal said. "The woman who runs this cookhouse has kept you fed and your wounds dressed and your shirts mended for 6 weeks. You'll speak about her like a person, or you'll find somewhere else to eat." The room went very still. Rosalind at the stove did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the pot she was stirring, but her hands, which had gone tight on the ladle handle, slowly released. Aldous Cray started 3 sentences and finished none of them. He ate the rest of his supper in silence and was gone from camp before the end of the week, having discovered a sudden preference for a different outfit farther west. That evening, after supper, Dougal stopped in the cookhouse doorway with his hat in his hands. He said, "I should have said something sooner," she said. "You said it when it mattered." He nodded, relieved, and left. A few minutes later, Everard came in from the cold, unwrapping his scarf, and found her sitting at the table with a cup of tea and the particular expression of someone who has just passed through something. He looked at her for a moment. "What happened?" she told him, briefly. When she finished, he stood there with his coat still on and the cold still on him, and something moved through his expression that he didn't try to hide. He said, "I'll have words with Cray," she said. "He's already gone." Dougal handled it. He looked at her steadily. "And you?" "I'm fine." She said it plainly, the way she said most things, not as dismissal but as fact. He hung up his coat. He sat down across from her. He didn't say anything for a while, and then he said, "You've had to be fine a lot of times, haven't you?" She looked at her tea. "I expect most people have," he said. "That doesn't mean it doesn't cost something." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, "No, it doesn't." They sat there in the lamplight as the fire in the stove cracked and settled, and neither of them moved to end the evening. Spring came slow that year, the way it always did north of the lake, grudgingly, with false starts and late cold snaps that drove the men back into their heavy coats just when they'd put them away. The river ice broke in the 2nd week of April, and the cutters began to drift south as the season wound down, heading back to their families or their boarding houses, or whatever arrangement they'd made for the winter. One by one, the cookhouse grew quieter. On the last day that Dougal's crew was on site, he came to say goodbye to Rosalind in the cookhouse and stood there with his big hands hanging at his sides, awkward as a schoolboy. "Best cookhouse I've worked in 20 years, he said. "And I've worked in a lot of bad ones." She shook his hand. "Come back in the fall if Everard will have you. He would have had to pull me away." He tipped his hat and left. She stood in the door and watched the sleds move down the mill road until they disappeared into the tree line, and then she was alone in the camp for the first time since January. Everard was up at the North Cut, doing the last inventory before closing the season. She started on the cookhouse accounts. When he came back that afternoon, he found the ledger on the table with a note paper clipped to the front that said, in her clean handwriting, "You're overpaying for salt pork. Suggest switching to Beaumont & Sons in Kenora. Check their rates. Saves $12 over the season." He looked at the note for a long moment. Then he sat down and read the full accounts. She'd reconciled 3 months of receipts, identified 2 billing errors from the supply company, and written a half-page summary of what should be ordered differently before the fall season. He had hired bookkeepers who hadn't done as thorough a job. She came in from checking the root cellar, found an error in the December lard order, she said. "They charged you twice. I've written to them." He looked up at her. "You've been doing this all morning?" It needed doing. He set the ledger down carefully. "Rosalind." She stopped, he said. "When the camp closes for the season, I go back to Harwick. I manage the timber contracts and the supply accounts from there until August. I have a house on Birch Street. It's too large for one person." He paused. "I'm not proposing anything indecent. I'm telling you the situation and asking you what you'd like to do about it." She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light came through the cookhouse window at an angle and caught the dust in the air between them. She said, "What are the other options?" He said honestly, "You could go to Harwick and find other employment. I'd write you a letter. Anyone would hire you." She was quiet. "And if I stay, you'd have the use of the south room. There's a lock on the door." He met her eyes. "Same arrangement as here. You're not obligated to anything you haven't agreed to," she said. "You keep saying that," he said. "I keep meaning it." She held his gaze. Then she said, "All right, but I want to be clear about one thing." He waited. She said, "I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I'm staying because I choose to." "There's a difference," he said. "I know the difference." She nodded. "Then let's go to Harwick." The house on Birch Street was a solid, modest place, the kind built by someone who intended permanence rather than impression. 2 stories, a covered porch, a kitchen garden that had gone slightly to seed over a winter of inattention. The south room had an east-facing window and a writing desk and a quilt that had been folded in a trunk long enough to smell of cedar. Rosalind took one look at the kitchen and put her sleeves up. Everard's housekeeper, a cautious woman named Mrs. Quill, who had been coming twice a week since Harriet died, arrived on the second morning and stopped in the doorway with an expression that was not quite welcome and not quite alarm. Rosalind introduced herself clearly. She explained her role without embarrassment or apology. She asked Mrs. Quill whether she preferred to continue with her usual days and left the answer entirely up to her. Mrs. Quill, who had been prepared for something considerably harder to manage, said Thursday and Saturday suited her fine and found herself, by some mechanism she couldn't quite explain, making tea for them both 20 minutes later. The town of Harwick was less gracious. It was not a large town, and it had the instincts of a small one, which is to say it noticed things and talked about them without too much concern for accuracy. A woman living in Everard Colquhoun's house was a fact that passed from the post office to the dry goods store to the church vestibule in less than a week, and it passed with the kind of speed that meant it was carrying something extra. The version that arrived at the ladies' auxiliary meeting that Thursday was that Everard had brought a woman down from the lumber camp, details unclear, nature of the arrangement much speculated upon. By the following Sunday, there were 3 versions, none of them kind to Rosalind. She heard enough of this to know the shape of it. She said nothing. She went to the market on Fridays. She introduced herself to the neighbors. On either side, she sat in the 3rd pew at St. Andrew's and was polite to everyone who greeted her and composed about the ones who didn't. The hardest moment came in early June. She had gone to Finlay's dry goods to order thread and notions and was waiting at the counter when Gertrude Oldham, wife of the alderman, president of the auxiliary, a woman who had learned to make her judgments sound like concern, came to stand beside her. Gertrude said, in a voice pitched for carrying, "I do admire your nerve, coming into town as though it were all perfectly ordinary." Rosalind set down her order slip. She turned and looked at Gertrude Oldham directly. She said, "I cook, I keep accounts, and I manage a household. I came from a lumber camp to this town because I was offered reasonable employment by a decent man. If there's something in that arrangement that offends you, Mrs. Oldham, I expect you'll survive the offense." The counter went quiet. Young Billy Finlay, who was 17 and had been trying to look busy with a bolt of canvas, went completely still. Gertrude Oldham's mouth opened. What she had expected was a flinch, possibly tears. She had not prepared for calm. Rosalind collected her order slip. "I'd like 6 spools of cream thread when you have a moment," she said to Billy, who recovered himself admirably and began looking for them. She heard the door of the shop open behind her. As Gertrude left, she kept her eyes on the counter and breathed slowly. and did not let her hands shake until she was 2 blocks away on the empty stretch of Elm Street, where nobody was watching. By the time she reached Birch Street, her hands were perfectly steady. Everard was on the porch when she came up the walk, a cup of coffee in one hand, watching the way the late afternoon light hit the line of maples down the street. He could read her the way he had learned to read timber. By the grain of it, the way it held tension, he said. Something happened. She sat down in the other chair, she told him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll speak to Howard Aldham." She shook her head. "It won't help. It will make it worse." She paused. "What would help is if people understood clearly what I am in this house." He looked at her. She said, "I'm not asking for anything. I'm telling you what I observe. Whatever arrangement suits you is your business." He set down his coffee cup with a careful deliberateness that she had come to recognize as him composing himself. He said, "What arrangement suits you?" She looked at the maples for a moment. Then she said, "One that's honest." "Whatever it is," he said. "Rosalind, I've been trying to find the right moment for 3 months to tell you something, and I keep being cautious about it because I don't want to put any kind of pressure on you." He stopped, started again. "When Harriet died, I thought that was the end of the part of my life that had warmth in it. I made my peace with that. I was wrong." He met her eyes. "I would like to court you properly if you're willing. Not as obligation, not because the town needs a story that makes sense, because I would like to." A swallow flew low over the garden and vanished into the maple's shadow. Rosalind said, "You're asking my permission," he said. "It's the only way that matters." She was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she said, "Yes, you may." He exhaled, a slow, quiet breath, the kind a man lets out when he's been holding it for months. She looked back at the maples, and there was something in her face that was not quite a smile, but was the thing that comes just before the moment when a person realizes that something good is, in fact, going to happen to them, that they are allowed to let it. They sat on the porch until the light was gone, not saying very much, which had always been the language they were best at. Summer deepened, and with it, the town's understanding shifted in the slow, grudging way that small towns revise themselves, not by announcement, but by accumulation of evidence. Mrs. Quill told the butcher's wife that Miss Hale ran the most orderly house on Birch Street. Dougal Fenn, passing through Harwick in July on his way to a new camp, stopped at the dry goods and told Billy Finlay, loudly enough to ensure it would travel, that Rosalind was the best camp cook and the sharpest accountant he'd seen in 20 years of timber work, and anyone who had questions about her character could come find him. Young Soren Hawk wrote a letter to Everard, thanking him for the season and adding a postscript, asking him to please thank Miss Hale for looking after his hand, because it had healed clean and he thought it probably would have gone bad otherwise. Everard read the postscript to Rosalind over breakfast. She looked at the letter for a moment, then went back to her toast and said nothing. But the color in her face was warmer than the morning warranted. In August, Rosalind's father came to Harwick. She was in the kitchen garden on a Tuesday morning, staking up the late beans, when she heard the gate and turned to find him standing at the end of the path. He was thinner than she remembered, and his coat was wrong for the season, and he had the look of a man who had been composing a speech for some time. He said, "Rosalind, I heard you'd done well for yourself." She stood up slowly. She had thought over the months about what she would feel in this moment. She had not been entirely sure. What she felt was clear. She said, "Father," he said, "I made a mistake. A man can be sorry for a mistake." She looked at him for a long time. The morning was very quiet around them, just birds and the distant sound of the mill. She said, "You were sober enough to hold a pen. You knew what you were signing." His face moved through several things. Then he said, "I heard you're with Colquhoun now. I thought maybe, since it worked out, you might see your way too," she said. "No, just the one word. Flat and final, with no anger in it, because anger would have given him too much." He tried again. "She was your father's daughter once." Doesn't that count for, she said. What you traded away gave me everything I have. She paused. I'm not grateful to you for that. I'm grateful to myself. There's a difference. He stood there with the speech he'd prepared, going to pieces in the summer air around him. Everard came around the side of the house then, having heard the voice from the workshop. He stopped when he saw the situation, and he looked from the man to Rosalind and back, and he said nothing. Just stood there, present. Rosalind looked at her father once more. You should go, he went. He did not look back. She stood in the garden for a moment after the gate closed, her hand resting on the beanstakes, the sun warm on her shoulders. Then she breathed out, slow and deliberate, and turned back to her work. Everard came to stand beside her. He didn't ask if she was all right. He had learned by then that she would tell him what she wanted him to know. After a moment, she said, I used to wonder what I'd say to him. He waited, she said. It turns out there wasn't much to say. He picked up the ball of twine she'd set down and handed it back to her. She took it. Their hands touched, brief and warm, and neither of them moved away. They were married in September, a Thursday, at St. Andrew's. No large ceremony. Everard had never cared for them, and Rosalind had said, when they'd discussed it, that she preferred the real thing to the performance of it. Dougal Fenn stood up with Everard. Mrs. Quill sat in the second pew and looked satisfied in the way of someone who has always expected events to come right. Young Billy Finlay came, to no one's particular surprise. Gertrude Oldham was not there. This was, in its own way, a kind of tribute. Rosalind wore a dove-gray dress she had made herself, and the morning light in the church caught the silver threads in it and made them shine like something she'd earned, which she had. Afterward, in the churchyard, people came to them in ones and twos. The neighbor, from the left side of Birch Street, who had brought a pie the previous autumn and asked no questions. The mill manager's wife, who had quietly passed Rosalind's name to two families looking for a household accountant. Howard Oldham, without his wife, who shook Everard's hand and said something genuine about it. Rosalind accepted each greeting with the same steady warmth that she brought to everything. Present, unhurried, asking nothing extra from anyone. When the mill manager's wife said, "You've done so much for this town," Rosalind said, "I've only done what was needed." Which was both true and an understatement, and she knew it and didn't correct it. On the way home, Everard helped her into the wagon and paused with his hand over hers. He said, "The town's come around." She looked at him with a faint, comfortable amusement. The town made up its mind what was true. It just took them a while to check it. He smiled at that. It was a quiet smile, the kind that lived mostly in his eyes, and she had come to know it the way you come to know the particular light in a place you've chosen to stay. 5 years on, the house on Birch Street was a different sort of house than the one she had arrived at. The kitchen garden had expanded into the back lot, tidy and productive and slightly more ambitious each year. The south room had become a study because Rosalind had taken on the bookkeeping for 4 local businesses and needed somewhere to spread out the ledgers. The camp at Dunmore's Reach had expanded to include a second cutting claim, and every season's accounts were cleaner than the one before. Dougal came back every fall as he'd said he would. He brought his nephew one year. And Rosalind taught the boy to read a provision ledger before he was 16, which Dougal said was worth more than anything he'd learned in school. She taught reading on Sunday afternoons in the front room to a small group of children from the mill workers' families. 3 of them at first, then 7, then 12. Mrs. Quill helped on the Saturdays when Rosalind's youngest was underfoot and not yet convinced that sitting still was a reasonable request. Their daughter was named Clara. Their son, who came 2 years after, was called Thomas. Everard had suggested it quietly one evening, and Rosalind had looked at him for a long moment and said yes, and the name settled into the house like something that had been waiting to come home. On an evening in early October, when the maples on Birch Street had gone red and gold, and the air had that particular clarity that comes just before the cold, Everard found Rosalind on the back porch, watching the children at the far end of the garden. Thomas was trying, with immense 4-year-old seriousness, to catch a frog in the drain ditch. Clara was advising him in a way that was going to result in both of them being muddy before long. Everard stood beside her. She said, without turning. "He's going to fall in," he said. "Yes." They watched in comfortable companionship as Thomas did, in fact, fall in. Clara's response was a kind of resigned expertise. Thomas treated it as a triumph. Everard said quietly, "You ever think about that first day? The camp road, the cold sometimes." She glanced at him. "Do you?" He nodded. "I think about the look on your face when I told you the truth about what your father had done. You didn't break, you just calculated," she said. "I had already spent 23 years learning not to rely on other people's decisions about my worth. One more bad decision was just arithmetic," he said. "And now?" She was quiet for a moment, watching her children. Then she said, "Now the arithmetic's better." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into it, and they stood there. As the October light came low and golden over the garden, catching on the red maples and the muddy, delighted faces of their children, and the solid, unhurried fact of a life they had built together, one honest choice at a time. Worth, she had learned, was not assigned. It was not traded for or inherited or bestowed by men who thought they had the authority to measure it. It was something quieter than that, something built in the hours before dawn and the evenings at a lamp and the ordinary daily decision to remain whole and present and ungiven to anyone who had not earned the right to your trust. She had known that at 23, in the snow outside a gambling man's back room. She simply had more evidence for it now.